Hello, theology nerds. This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you podcast episodes with some of the best scholars across multiple disciplines for you to think and reflect and work through those big, deep questions that you have and you carry. And today on the podcast is a live Q&A session with my friend Adam Clark. It was part of our ongoing Black Theology reading group. That's right, it's a reading group. It's online. There are 2,000 people currently reading through some amazing text in Black theology, looking primarily at James Cone and a number of other interlocutors. But if you want to, get access to our readings and to all of the resources that help you dig deep, like some amazing lectures and such that Adam did and conversations about the text, go to jamesconewasright.com. The questions here varied quite a bit from, things going on in the news, contemporary politics, presidential race type stuff, to Lebron James, to Black Panther, to thinking through images of the divine across cultures and such. It's a fun conversation. It's exciting. I hope you enjoy it. Now, before we jump in, I was want to remind you, you can go to jamesconewasright.com, right? jamesconewasright.com. Join the class right now. You can do it. Everything that's already happened is on a resource page ready for your access. So you won't even have to be behind. All right. But the one thing I really want to tell you is thank you. So many of you have already gotten my brand new book, Divine Self-Investment and Open and Relational Constructive Christology. A bunch of you have already gotten the book. It's been like #1 bestseller in systematic theology. What? So thank you. And if you haven't got the book, I would love for you to get it and check it out. I'm so excited to get to start hearing from people, seeing reviews and stuff posted up on blogs and that kind of thing. And anyway, I'm super pumped about it. It is an open and relational Christology. And if you want to know more about it, or just go to my website, tripfuller.com, trip with 2 P's. It's like falling over, but with an extra P, tripfuller.com. And you can find out more about it. Check out endorsements, that kind of thing. For those of you that are Homebrewed community members, that would be those of you who donate each month to make this whole thing possible for all the thousands and thousands of people that are listening. I will be reading you the book chapter by chapter. So if you are a member of the community, check out the private Homebrewed Christianity podcast feed. You will see that I've already put chapter 1 up there, and I've even thrown in, I record myself reading it. And then what do? I record a little 5-minute summary of what I think are the most important parts of that chapter. So, if you are sitting there going I read an academic book, I just want to get the book and give it a nice review on Amazon because I like Trip. But you can hear me give a summary of the big ideas of each chapter and read it to you in the Homebrewed Christianity members only podcast feed. If you're a member, check it out. If you're not, you can go to homebrewedcommunity.com and get on it. So one other thing, if you are a member, do check it out. Next Tuesday is Homebrewed Happy Hour, where Dan Koch from the You Have Permission podcast, Dustin Kinsrew from the band Thrice and stuff, they're coming. We're hanging out in Zoom with Homebrewed members, answering whatever questions and such y'all have that come up. And I'm sure whatever portion of it is safe for internet will end up at some point. But if you want to hang out with us, come. You can submit questions and things. If you are in the community, just check your email. You'll get the deets. All right, here we go. Adam Clark, Professor, Xavier University, talking about Black theology. It's part of our ongoing reading group. Come and join us. JamesConewasRight.com. Hello, everybody. This is
Hello.
Trip. I'm here with Dr. Adam Clark, and it's Q&A day. Q&A, question and answers. Though Answer is a very broad category. Like it's more confident than general response, but it's not a solution. So,
right, exactly.
Yeah. So, well, before we jump in, maybe you can say so what's going on in your part of the world and beginning of the semester and that kind of thing.
It's a whirlwind. The beginning of the semester, we are doing hybrid here, and the administrators are just on pins and needles about trying to keep our numbers down. It feels like not day, but every other day I get another student saying how they're quarantining because maybe their roommate or a friend, contracted COVID-19. And we only have about 23 cases right now on campus. But, this disease, or this virus, spreads so exponentially. Like that could jump to 40 or 120. Like it's just not like just by numbers.
Right.
So there's a big concern. But the university is taking it very, very seriously. They've kind of retrofitted the classrooms and, masks are required, no protests, no anything like it's a mandatory thing. So we have to work together. So, so far we've managed to at least limit, but it's been tough. But you've been in the news. How does it feel to be Jerry Falwell's Jr.'s ex-pool boy who actually got away? So, like, how's that been for you, man?
Oh, man. That you got to admit that story's crazy, right? This year, 2020, no, it is pretty horrible. But one of the difficult parts, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Jesuit, elderly Jesuit man, that, every 2 or 3 times a year, we have long conversations to try to seek the spiritual wisdom, right? And I said, Father Joe, a lot of my sweeping judgments towards certain groups of people that I used to think were exaggerations, they're performing them currently.
Exactly.
Right? Like, yeah. How you used to think that, or I would say, like, I think the Republicans are just racist and stuff like that, right? Like, but then I'd be like, don't trip. You have Republican family and friends, like, and they're not all that horrible, blah, 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 blah. And then this happens. Or then you say to yourself, like, Jerry Falwell was an independent Baptist for a long time. And then when the Southern Baptist Convention was taken over by fundamentalists, they end up being Southern Baptists, and then you're like, oh no, they're just out for like power and possessions, and they're like a giant ruse, and they don't really believe any of this, and who knows whatever they're doing behind the scenes. Like, I didn't even know to suggest pool boy and sit in the corner style. Like, that wasn't like,
and Larry Flint is turning over in his grave.
Yeah. And why, like, in one sense, like, you laugh at it because what else are you going to do? But on the other side, like, I really don't know what to do when the, like, internal judgments towards people I didn't like, then they start doing things that make me justify. Like, I don't need any encouragement to think worse about people. Right. And I don't know what to do with that.
Well, it's almost like seeing Oz. Like, you kind of, see behind the curtain and you're like, wow, this is worse than I thought. Like, this guy is shorter than I thought. He's greener than I thought. And I'm sitting there. I grew up on this big voice of Christianity by the don'ts. Don't do this. Don't do this. And then you find out behind the curtain, it's this type of free for all where people are just doing all types of stuff. And it's worse than you imagined. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's so it makes you go back and kind of question the voice. Like, what was that voice all the time? And people who are policing me through these type of don'ts all the time. And now I'm, at a mature place where I'm rethinking how to actually live out my faith. And I'm seeing the people who are actually deeply influential are not who they said they were.
Yeah. So, there might be a better way of asking this because I hadn't thought about asking it, but I was talking with two friends of mine, and we were venting, and they are much more recently ex-evangelical ministers and very successful at it, right? And so, but as they became more progressive, it cost them quite a bit of money to take a stand on justice issues, LGBTQ inclusion, environmental stuff like that, right? Like left big jobs, and one is serving a small mainline congregation now, and the other is like realtor, website design or something, but his favorite things is like pub discussion group, right? So and they're sitting there, and when we are talking about the NBA playoffs, because that's mostly what we talk about.
Okay.
And then they said, "Look, Tripp, wait, why are you still a Christian? Like, what point, right?" And this was not that long after we had talked about is Christianity a white man's religion? And my natural response, like it wasn't like a planned one, was, I leaned over, I grabbed the James Cone book, and I was like, James Cone's a good reason to still be a Christian, right? Like one of the gifts for people that are deconstructing, especially ones that had internalized kind of slaveholder religion, whether or not they would have identified it that way then, is to see that the tradition where you encountered God never had the monologue that it wanted you to have, right? Like when you give that example of the big voice behind the curtain, like it wanted to act like the only thing going on in Oz was this one, one voice, but it was never the only one. And it's not even the most beautiful one. Yeah. And when you contrast that question of, which is more difficult, like wrestling with the atheist or wrestling with inhumanity, as a theological question, like what is the biggest problem, whether or not you believe in God or whether or not you want to call, this justice? And then I think when you make that shift, all of a sudden the people you're in the boat with of life and faith are inspiring and challenging and animating in different ways. And when you're there, the other task is like figuring out how to receive the blessings that you were given in that period in time of your life, and not like chuck it all, right? Like they're like, I had a Sunday school teacher that told me horrible atonement theories that my parents didn't even know they were allowed to say at church because my dad was the minister. And she also told me other beautiful things. I remember her saying to me, no, Tripp, the most true thing about you is you're God's beloved. And it stuck with me my whole life. And I tell it to my kids and hope they remember it. Right. Like, so like, how do you separate? How do you think it through? And when they go like, how can you still be a Christian? Part of it is like, when you use that phrase, like what boat are you in and who's in there with you can make answering it differently.
Well, Tripp, you're putting your finger on something that progressive and liberationists have a hard time today responding to. And part of it, they don't care, but even when they don't care, it has an impact on them. And the question is, what is the public meaning of Christian faith? When I ask a lot of progressive Christians that, they're like, well, I don't care what publicly. They don't want to get in a debate or a contestation over the identity of the faith. And Cone did. Mm-hmm. And I'm bringing this because that was particularly Cone's message. He was like, what is the public meaning of Christian identity? Right? Not people's person, but what's the public meaning? How are we going to? So he wanted to engage in the fight about this in a very public way. Most people who came after him find that they want to surrender because they find it either triggering to do that, because it gets into who's Christian, who's not. Right? It has always got to be boundaries on Christian identity. And progressives are almost instinctively reluctant to actually have a boundary on Christian identity. They're like, well, whoever claims Christianity is Christian, that kind of thing. And I think also has to do with, like, in the academy, the rise of postmodernism, right? In terms of those loosening boundaries. And actually, the way I describe it for people who are academics is that during the emergence of liberation theology, you had sociology as the main conversation partner. If you went to school in like the 80s or the 90s, graduate school, you had English or you had literature, the humanities, like that kind of thing. So with postmodern, these are mostly humanities people who come up and they're deconstructing the thing. Mm-hmm. With the earlier radical thinkers, these people came out of sociology department. So you have much more of a material emphasis and base on it and a much more sharper focus on liberation, right? So I think part of it has to do with that, of us surrendering the public meaning to people we vehemently disagree with, but we always have to be reactive to it.
And I think the criticism of the public meaning is important, just because it's kind of like not saying anything when all your friends are making fun of your parents, like if you don't have to agree with them, but if you just decide to let it get said all the time, we already know kind of like there's some issues there. And I think like one of the things Cone does, and this was in the reading last week, and
but we have abusive parents. That's the point. Progressives' ideas that their parents have been abusive, right? So they don't want to talk about it because they're like, well, it's my meeting internally, but they don't want to. They don't want to debate this on CNN. When CNN gets someone who represents the Christian vote, right? It's always an evangelical. It's not even a mainline Christian anymore. It's always, they get William Barber out, he's there to talk about mostly race issues, not specifically Christian issues.
Yeah, I actually think I think Cornel West should go on a whole lot more often, because he's extremely gifted at being like distinctively Christian and affirming of whoever's around the table. And if he has to talk to some like right-wing Christian or whatever, he'll say things like, well, I still got a little terrorist in me, and because he uses the confession of his own sin. Right. And it's simultaneously, how am I identifying with the Trump Christian in front of me? Well, we all have a little terrorist on the inside. Right, and I'm like, well played. Well played.
Cornel is brilliant. Like, I just wish progressives who don't have to be brilliant in order to be on television. I want the average local, congressional clergyman, just like the average evangelical, get on there and spout their doctrinaire stuff. I want to make it safe for progressives to actually open the public meeting and speak with authority, right? Mm-hmm. Speak with authority about their convictions about poverty, their convictions about social justice and racial justice and that kind of thing.
Do you think part of it is the revelation question? Right. And I think this is one of Cone's general critiques towards mainline Protestantism is, and this is like the way he blends. This is okay. The evening will not stay this nerdy, but the way Cone takes the otherness of God and God's self-defining event in Karl Barth, right? God tells you who God is in Karl Barth, and then takes that kind of energy and then puts it into Tillichian correlation model with culture, and then goes, the culture that God comes to is not I hand roll cigarettes and talk about existentialist philosophy, Paul, but the underside, and then like takes this revelation, but then situates it in a culture. And so you get this connection of the Black Power movement being a location for thinking theologically of the rupture of the transcendent God's arrival, right? And like at one point in the reading for, it all ran together, but he said something like, if you want to know who God is, you have to go where God said God would be. And Jesus literally says a few places he'll show up, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I will be with the poor, outcast, those in prison, blah, 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 right? All that list, like Matthew 25. I will be in any community that is doing what? And then he looks at the sending of the disciples in Luke and Matthew to cast out demons, proclaim liberty, liberation to the captives, all that kind of stuff. And then says, when you celebrate this meal. Well, what's the meal talking about? Mm-hmm. Jesus getting axed by the state and God going, no basket, that doesn't work, right? Like, so those are like, God tells you who God is in these moments. If you want to know who God is, you have to put yourself in the position where God speaks to you. And so many mainline Protestants, especially white ones, have resisted a concept of God and God's self-testimony or the doctrine of revelation, where the content of revelation is something God gives and isn't understood as really a completely human product that, emerges from a community and a tradition. And you can see that in, what's his name? He was in the first reading section, but he also wrote the kind of Black Humanist theology book, Anthony
Penn. Yes.
Yeah. So he basically gives a reading of Black theology as if it was the hermeneutics of liberal white Protestants, where the culture, the community's generating what they call God or projecting it or whatever. And so he's like, you can do it without God. But Cone's is like, God's telling you who God is, and God's black, and the cross is the lynching tree. And so there's that dynamism there. And if you think of mainline Protestants, so many of them lack the authority that comes from feeling, in a sense, burdened with the gospel. So anyway, I was trying to think of a way of talking about it without going into a whole discussion of revelation and contemporary theology, but I do think that that's part of it.
But I think you identify, I think one of the questions, the way I would frame it, right. I think there's such an appeal to experience, right? Like that, the question becomes, do you believe there's a transformative force outside of yourself? Right? Like in terms of that. And I think that when people publicly talk about Christianity, they're really trying to appeal to that. They're trying to name and identify that, right? And perhaps some of the kind of liberal Christianity, they don't make as enough of an appeal. I mean, you do see that with reactions, like the reaction to Donald Trump on the Washington Mall, like coming back, you have like kind of progressive Christians saying, no, that's inappropriate. And even I think the pastor or cleric of the cathedral coming up there and kind of setting that straight. But I think the general thing, I'm teaching a King course right now, or King is part of the course. And it's just interesting just to see how liberal Protestantism was the defining reality in the 1960s and 50s, right, in terms of that. And how now, probably starting with the 80s with Ronald Reagan, right, it becomes the evangelicals that become the defining kind of public meaning of what Christianity actually is, right? And I think that there hasn't been a sufficient enough or strong enough voice in progressive Christianity that actually kind of captures the imagination of the public in a similar way to King did in the 60s. Right? And I think we have very talented, very creative, but it hasn't been a galvanizing vision for Christian faith, while somehow the issues of abortion, anti-gay legislation have somehow captured the imagination of the right and made a unity over those type of issues, both politically and personally, in a way that progressive have not. It's just a bizarre kind of landscape for contemporary Christianity.
Yeah, and if you just think of that big period of shifts, so like who are the dominant theologians, when the dominant theologians are that James Cone's engaging are people like Niebuhr or Tillich, Karl Barth, people like that. Yes, they are blind in lots of ways to systemic racism and such, but if you ask them about oppression and injustice, you aren't going to have to convince them that the proper lens for interpreting sin is something other than individual responsibility, right? Like Niebuhr and Tillich and Barth are all socialist in some sense.
Yeah, Christian socialism. I was just talking.
Yeah. And so like you don't have to convince them that the actual best lens to look at, state violence through a militarized police units put in low poverty areas isn't that, well, I mean, there may have been a knife under there that he was going for, right? Like, because what do we have to figure out? How he's really responsible. Like, you can't go like, nah, that's really probably not the best way of doing it. And so when the gospel gets shrunk to something that the most successful neoliberal capitalist who exploits millions of workers just needs to ask Jesus in their heart to get right with God, say like Jeff Bezos or Donald Trump, then what Christianity is covering up, like what it's keeping hidden, is the rampant power of sin. It's essentially like demonic with Jesus covering, but like that to me is like one of the problems is like King wrote a dissertation engaging white theologians who at least acknowledged something more than escapist understandings of salvation and sin management. And now the dominant version of Christianity that reigns on the public airways is compliant, not just with white supremacy, but with the denial of our connected to the whole globe economically and ecologically. It is a giant suicide mission. Like white evangelicalism is a death cult. And that's why we got to challenge them, because they aren't Christian. And I've always thought this for years. And then they would go and perform everything to let me know about it. Like they've gone off the rails so much that their favorite Bonhoeffer scholar sucker punches somebody and thinks it's funny. And I'm like, what? Like, just because you created Bob the Tomato and Larry the Cucumber and doesn't mean this makes sense. Like, and this is what, I don't know. I don't want to be mean. I do think it's like an important thing. And I've had conversations with a few of my family members that don't see any of that. And I don't know, outside of maybe a few hymns and a few prayers, like what is connecting our religious traditions. Like we could read the same passages and something completely different comes up.
Absolutely.
Right? Like you read the story of Zacchaeus, and what interesting things Luke says. I don't know, that he's a Jewish tax collector in Jericho, which is a city built to imitate Rome by Herod. And everyone knows who he is in the town because he's filthy rich from exploiting them. None of that is interesting to them. They're like, well, he happens to be rich probably because he worked hard. And so all these details are just sitting in there about like the political, social, economic situation. Those don't matter. Like what really matters is that Jesus invited him to his house and that he became a Christian. And I bet a bunch of those people that were judging him, probably unjustly, because they were just bitter that they hadn't worked so hard to get rich like a chief tax collector. They might go to his house and see how much money he has, even though he gave half of it away, and knows that success comes by walking deep with the Lord. And
you're pointing to a larger question. Here's the, there's a Constantinian and a prophetic edge of every tradition. And what we're finding out now more than ever is that the Constantinian Christians, the Constantinian Muslims, the Constantinian Jewish folks have more in common with each other than they do with the prophetic edge of their own tradition. And the prophetic Christians and the prophetic Muslims and the prophetic Jews have more in common with each other than other members of their own tradition. So I think it's a lot of it has to do with the wings of our traditions, right? You can see this over the debate over Israel and people who identify with the Palestinian struggle as well, right? Like in terms of that, but you can see it throughout in terms of the issues. So I think a lot of it has to do with which part of our tradition are we in solidarity, or it helps our identity formation, right? Like in terms of that, like, when you were saying earlier, your kind of rhetorical questions, to me, it's about breaking the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness.
Yeah.
Right. And you see all these evangelicals just bearing false witness and the consequences of that. Right. So the question for me, it's always been settled in the Black community. The Black community voted, over 90%, like in terms of the last election. But the majority, to me, when we talk about, because some people have been asking about the upcoming elections, right, and how Christianity is going to react to it. But, the Black community, this has been settled since, before 2016, like in terms of that. But to me, like, it's the white community that's perplexing, because the majority of whites voted for Trump. The majority of women voted against Hillary, white women, right? So to me, it's the charge where Black theology helps, and I think this has been restated by people like Jim Wallace, is that they're white before they're evangelical, right? They're white before they're Christians. And you can see whiteness as a controlling category to understand, to reinterpret their faith. To me, that is the greatest example of that in contemporary times, because you have a person who is so brazen with, I don't even want to, what do I have to ask for forgiveness for, right? Like in terms of so brazen about building walls and not bridges, right? Mm-hmm. Like it just explicitly just contradicts the teachings that they've been doing, and they still vote for him. To me, that has nothing to do with faith, but yet they coalesce over him over certain types of, they have to do intellectual acrobatics. And not just that, they actually expunge people from within their ranks who have a critique of them, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just, hey, this is you, we can let 100 flowers bloom. They bully people within their own traditions who actually have a different take on it. That's what makes it so mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's it's mind-boggling.
Right. Well, the reason why I pause, because you're more connected, I should say, in terms of your family members and your background.
It doesn't. In the interesting thing for me is, if you had asked me kind of like 6 years ago which family members would turn which direction, I couldn't have guessed it, or friends and stuff. And so I am very grateful my parents didn't go crazy, and now they're like, even, like challenging me in ways. So like that, I for friends who that's not their experience, it just has to hurt, right? Especially when I signed into a friend of mine's Facebook, and he is like been a Republican like forever. And, I read the article on how like Trump is like dumping all this money in Facebook advertising, and probably so is Russia. And the top stories on Facebook are always like these crazy, like Ben Shapiro. I tried listening to him like a couple times. I'm like, y'all call this smart? And I listened to his episode on philosophy. I'm like, it's not even right. It was like, this isn't correct. I could do a better job explaining how to be conservative than you, at least in like accurately like telling you what particular philosophers said.
I feel the same way about Candace Owens and people like that. I'm like, this is smart. Is this supposed to be smart? I don't see it. I don't see the appeal. Tommy, what's her name? Tommy, whatever her name is. I can't remember.
I signed in. It's scary, man. And so I messaged my friend like after, and like, 30 minutes of scrolling around, I was like, you want to sign into mine and look, like, because we don't live in the same world. Like, other than each other's posts show up, you would have thought that like every city run by a Democrat is being like burnt up by a bunch of Rastafarians and hippie white guys, and are running around on skateboards with Molotov cocktails and things like that. And I'm like, really?
Trip, that's a real problem. Disinformation or post-truth.
Yeah.
Academically, we call it post-truth, but the probably popular world is more disinformation campaign. And that to me is one of the most scariest things about the future of our democracy. Right? Not just even Christian faith, but democracy itself. To me, I don't know if a democracy can survive if our public space is so polluted with that type of disinformation, right? Where we have so many alternate realities. It used to be we had the same common set of facts, but we have different interpretations of it. But now there's an epistemic war going on about even how to know that we don't even have a common set of facts to argue from. And to me is the most dangerous thing to the unraveling of democracy itself. To me, that's a bigger threat to the country where the president gets up there and actually denies science, right? Like just brazenly denies. Oh, the COVID cases are getting better, right? Like when you appeal, independent of the fear base, but when you actually don't have reliable facts as centered or bottom lining, right? It's hard because, especially in a country that's 300 plus million people, right? Like it's not just a small thing. I mean, it's a big thing. So you have to rely on a centralized source to kind of even genuflect to keep people cohesion, right? To keep cohesion together. And I don't know if we don't even have that as a central force of cohesion to react to, how the future is going to survive as a collective, right? It seems like we'll go back to, either successionist renderings, right? Like they talk about, but the type of, before America had like a strong federal government, like everybody just do their own thing, right? I just don't know if that could happen in a contemporary area. Like what the consequences of that are.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, if you think of what happened in Europe when you had the emergence of new networks of relations via economy and technologies of communication like the printing press and stuff, that's like where you had the wars of religion for it was like 35 years of intense wars that kept breaking out all over the place. And I mean, I feel like the internet poses like that similar possibility. The same time, you have a growing number of people who are, for plenty of good reasons, not just bad ones, like leaving historic wisdom traditions. And we don't know what human beings do when large numbers of them are not participating in communities with shared narratives of meaning, purpose, and value and stuff. Like every culture we've ever known until relatively recently had those like type of shared meta narrative bonds and stuff. Anyway, like I think there's like a lot of questions going on. And what strikes me is like the most important thing to think of, apart from like not dying because we kill the planet, is we know that the best thing you can do to help someone not make dumb decisions and not act out of the worst parts of ourselves is to alleviate the most basic anxieties, which are like, health, finance, being able to eat, care, educate, and things. So like if we wanted a better populace, we would not be starving like access to education, healthcare, and then creating structures of debt for young adults that then force them into vocations that aren't life-giving in order to pay off student loans. And you wouldn't be using petty crimes as ways of removing adults from their communities and families. Like they're just basic and they all seem like if you were just like, you know what, Adam, I just love the Lord and I'm so pro-family. And you're like, really? Wow. I know you may not believe in climate change, but what about Christian psychology? And so like, that's why I don't like, I find it so disingenuous. Like, it's not like you're going to want to just pollute the earth while like doing policies that are just like obviously good for families because you do it for yours. But if it's a black family, you don't care, right? Let's think about schools. Like, if you watch a Republican, like, they're like, oh, we got to give people school choice. School choice is a synonym for Jim Crow had to reevaluate how to get access to money for white schools. Like, and it's not even hard to point it out. Like, you can just go look at studies of when you give more school freedom, what happens. Anyway, like, so I just don't believe they care. Now, they might be ignorant, and that's like really hard.
Well, here's I think the obligation now, what we should encourage is about truth telling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bearing witness, probably the number one Christian priority ought to be truth telling. That's the prophetic edge. And I think in this time of illusion, this time of deception, this time when the president gets up there and says, well, the problem in Portland, right? The problem of in our cities is that the police are under siege. Right? Not that people are being killed, right? That protesters are getting it. The problem in Kenesha are that police are under siege and they're not getting a break. Not that black men are getting shot in the head, right? When people like gaslight you like that, when you have politicians doing that, then the Christian response is to truth tell. When you have even about Biden, like some of us, like are not as excited. Let's put it that way. We're more excited about the anti-Trump, like putting a neo-fascist out of office than we are.
I feel like I'm as excited as he is. I don't know if that's high.
But it really is to tell the truth about both, right? It's like to kind of tell the truth about Trump, but the truth about Biden and say, look, we're part of a coalition. A coalition is different than an alliance, is that the coalition is temporary. The objective is to get Trump out of office. But once Trump is out of office, it's not like I'm going to relax my criticism of the alternative. It's just that I was there for the coalition. Mm-hmm. Right? So the idea is we want neo-fascism out. We see it's a more dangerous threat than we do against kind of this type of neoliberal kind of policies and that type of thing. So it's pick your poison, kind of thing.
I really don't get the, not being able to differentiate the two, even though I have friends that really can't. And, but
yeah, no, I agree.
I get if you're if you're in California, like whatever, but if you're in a state like that's anywhere close, I offered hypothetically, I guess, because it would be illegal, but I offered a couple of my friends in swing states. I'm like, look, what could I do to help you out? So like if I found someone to vote third party in California, maybe two will vote third party. We get them to agree. If you vote for good old Sleepy Joe, what?
Sleepy Joe.
I'll give you 2 Green Party votes in California for 1 Democratic vote in a swing state. Can we get a trade?
We have that problem under Nader, right? Like it's a similar type of dynamic went into the, in terms of that conversation. I say that conversation was big in 2000. Those of you who are Ralph Nader and even beyond that about like, who should we vote for? And, people try to do strategic voting, right? Like if you are in a solidly Democratic state, you can afford to. But if it's going to be close, I'm in Ohio, right? So my vote counts in Ohio. Ohio went overwhelmingly for Trump. So I'm going to be part of the resistance to that, right? I hope I can convince enough of my fellow citizens to do the same. Looks like there's a possibility, but it's it's hard to say. It's very early right now. But this COVID-19, you would think. I mean, the projections are that. I mean, it's literally going to be World War II numbers dead by December 1st. There's 317,000 people that are projected to be dead by December. right? Can you imagine that? 317,000, right?
So the new thing on, if they didn't have these other issues, they shouldn't count as COVID deaths. Since this is on Facebook, someone I know of some closeness was ranting like, well, if probably COVID only killed 10,000 people if they didn't have other issues.
Oh my
and
God.
So like, I feel like I should, like, I don't know why I have to wear a mask. This individual is obese, high blood pressure, has had like asthma for a while,
Right.
and is like, well, I guess it's not really real. And I just I sent them a private message and said, just like, if you were scoring how many of the variables that make you more attractive to the COVID, like, you are ringing them up. So like, I don't think you're the person is looking for. I think the reference might be into like a 22-year-old that like is a senior in college and on a sports team, and like their worst like health problem was like two-a-days because they just love practicing cross country, like whether. And
that should not be also be the only index of misery, right? Like if you lose your hearing, like the way people say it, like, oh, there's going to be 300 deaths. There might be 500,000 that have certain types of enduring problems. I mean, just to be sick in and of itself is not fun, and to be severely sick. So to me, just even saying death as the ultimate, that's the ultimate worst. But that doesn't even describe the misery or the type of misery, not just if it's a caretaker or you're, not just to the person, but to the family, right? Like you actually come out of commission. So you disrupt. If it's that many numbers, if the number is that large, then the type of impact is far greater. Like it's almost probably like 500,000, right? If you're talking about that many actually dead, but in terms of the impact of that, it's about 500,000 people, right? So like it's almost like when people say, there is such and such such a number died in the Iraq war. But I'm like, okay, so my arm was blown off, my leg was blown off. It's like, but I'm not dead. I'm still living, but that still has a negative impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like no one talks about the maimed, the injured, the continue, and not to mention the psychologically, damaged people. That should be part of the index of which we're measuring its impact on human life.
Mm-hmm. So. And that there are a number of questions that came in that were, there are a few others that were connected to different contemporary topics. One of the ones I thought was good, that made me giggle was, why is LeBron James a better leader than the majority of ministers? And
because he has Messiah. He has Messiah tattooed across his back or something. And we are the witness, right?
If maybe you want to say a little bit about why someone would ask that question before tackling it, in case they haven't been. I'm a huge NBA fan, and I love LeBron James, and then he became a Laker, which is basically like. I mean, my love for the Lakers is so inappropriate. And, so on game days, I turn all my stuff off that I don't get an update because it starts at 2 a.m. here. So if I'm up, I'll watch like some and then get up and then watch it on League Pass, before I turn anything else on. So like while no one else is awake and I'm like, packing lunches at the coffee, I'll watch all the Laker games. And so like LeBron coming to the Lakers was one of the greatest days of my life. And now we're in the playoffs. It's just so wonderful.
So to give some background on what happened, for those people who are not basketball fans or NBA fans specifically, the NBA players, after the shooting of Jacob Blake, right? And this is actually, it started actually with the Milwaukee Bucks.
Mm-hmm.
They refused out of protest, right? Out of protest to play the game. I think it was the night after, I believe. And they did it at the last minute. And that started a ripple effect throughout the NBA in terms of people actually protesting and saying that, look, enough is enough. We need to do something different. Now, I don't think they had a hard plan. I think a lot of it was just the emotional reaction to it. But they wanted to get the owners and also the fans to actually consider. And if you haven't paid attention, one of the conditions on coming back and restarting the season had to do with actually an emphasis on racial justice. So you can see on their uniforms and in the messaging, you could see they actually have taglines like Black Lives Matter, enough is enough, I can't breathe. They have certain types of approved things on their back of their jersey also to kind of publicize it, to use the NBA as the platform. So that was one of the advantages. So what happened is that the players throughout the NBA started to really get together and say, and really try to question whether they're going to actually continue the entire season. And LeBron James was a leader at actually protesting. And he actually considered stopping the entire season over this issue. And that's actually unprecedented. And there's been a lot of history from Muhammad Ali, Oscar Robertson in basketball, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's been a lot of different types of protests, but there's been nobody who's actually, refused to actually, within the playoffs, right, to actually stop the entire season, right, over a racial justice issue. And he stepped forward and was willing to do it, actually voted. I think he talked to, the story as I heard it, is that they later called Barack Obama for advice and consultation. And he kind of continued, and Obama, I think his advice was, look, just use the NBA as your platform, continue the season, and they reconsider and they continue the season. So I think part of the question has to do with the way LeBron's central role in organizing the players, right, to get them to kind of be socially conscious and to actually make demands from the owners. They had some concessions from the owners, like they're turning the NBA arenas into voting polls or voting stations, and some other things in terms of that.
And he started a whole nonprofit, getting a lot of other athletes and stuff involved in registering people to vote, sure. And stuff, and did the strategic carrying the Malcolm X autobiography out to get his photo taken.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's this really great article in Pace Magazine's, or the online version of Pace Magazine, today or yesterday, where I'm about to say an inappropriate word, like right after or it's right after the Bucks said, like, we're not going out and stuff, like he posted like fuck this, why do y'all keep doing this right thing. And David Dark, one of my favorite writers, wrote this thing like this, like about King James prayers, right? And it was like this lament that was short, and then like looking at how far it traveled, all this stuff was a lament, and it communicates so much of what you like, of what it's like to people that follow him that have no idea what it's like to be a black man.
Wow. I like
and like seeing it as a prayer, and like that really latched on to me in thinking about, like if you think of all those elements, right? Like in the questions, like why is he a better leader than your minister? Like one is like he didn't, from at least from most reporting, was not thrilled that there was no plan, and then you just like don't go out, and then everyone's like, well, we're not going to go out if they didn't go out, and then like there's stoppage, right? Like, so a lot of ministers get in situations and they just wish there was a plan, and then you have to figure out how to make the best out of it, and then to turn Staples Center and all these places into voting booths and stuff, to think long term, right, and create the organization. But like I think the other part is like he's strategic about showing us what it's like to be present emotionally at a time where what people are expecting from you is performance and excellence. That's what everyone expects from LeBron. not that he's like not doing that in the playoffs like he's normally pretty amazing and in the playoffs, but like in the middle of it, he's also being intentional about like when they said, "Why are you reading Malcolm X's autobiography?" And they said, it's too timely, and we're still asking these same questions. Like, right. And then he like has this angry curse tweet, and then like, what is it? Like showing you what lament's like. It's like, I mean, I think there are those other type of things if you're thinking of what leadership looks like. And if you are a leader and a minister, even in, more moderate white congregations, figuring out ways you can publicly lament, model becoming informed and engaged in things, even while, doing what your job is at a high level is a positive thing as well. So.
Wow. That's a great response, Trip. But just to add to what you said, like
I also have a couple of LeBron James jerseys in my room, so well, I should have worn one but then you'd have to see exactly how pasty my shoulders are. Like the sun only gets to here. There's not a lot of it here. If it was in California, it'd be a lot better. Scotland, less sun.
But part of what makes his leadership, or what makes any leader effective and great, is the quality of how they wrestle and what makes LeBron James more effective than your local minister, I guess, if that's the question, is that he's open to wrestle with the fundamental issue of our time, racial justice. He does this by looking at St. Malcolm, right, and wrestling deeply. He had never read it. This guy didn't go to college, right? Like he's been a public figure since the age of 15 or 16 years old, where he's selling out stadiums. Was the first athlete, in high school on ESPN. They actually went to his game, right? Basketball, I think, at least.
Yeah.
And now he's in his third. I think he's 35 years old currently, and he's like reading Malcolm for the first time as a response to BLM, like really trying to say, look, I'm trying to ground myself in this. And Malcolm's autobiography, for those who've never read the book, is really probably the testimony of it's almost paradigmatic of the black male journey, meaning that Malcolm begins as a thug and then ends up as a righteous person, right? You can see his journey in the arc of his journey throughout. And he was assassinated at the very beginning, like about 10 years into his righteous journey. But you can see the arc of someone who could be so defiant, miserable, so thuggish, so gangsterish, and how they could transform miraculously. Some people actually compare it to the Confessions of Augustine, right? Like Augustine was very similar. You could also look at him in comparison to the story of Ignatius of Loyola, right? Who gets shot by a cannonball and has to recover, and all of a sudden has certain types of impulses to actually become a saint, right? But he was like a womanizer, a hard drinker, someone who actually, cursed and was great at a party probably, but, had a radical transformation. So Malcolm probably fits in that venue of autobiographical experiences. And for LeBron to wrestle so deeply, right, at a very core level with that notion and trying to apply it to his personal life, I think is better than most ministers because they don't wrestle with it. It doesn't unsettle them. It doesn't disturb them. So to be open to be disturbed and unsettled, to me, is one of the fundamental qualities of great leadership. Also speaking truth to power, right? Being fearless. He actually had to speak to the owners. I mean, he's a millionaire, but they're billionaires. There's a big difference, right? To actually speak to these billionaires and get concessions and accommodations is better than a leader. And probably lastly, the work of anger and the purpose of justice, right? Like we talked about, and this gets back to the lament. The lament was a certain sadness, but also produced anger, and to allow your anger to be a creative anger, to work for. And this is why I think he was right to continue the season, right? Your anger could actually be destructive or creative, right? I think if they would have closed if they would have ended the season right there, there would be, for people who are not LeBron, which is most people, they're not celebrities, they're players, right? Which is the majority of people. Mm-hmm. They would have went home and they would have had their anger actually just maybe consume them. And sometimes that leads to kind of self-destructive stuff. But while you have the platform, your anger could be used creatively to channel and actually spread the message. And I think that's why I celebrate them actually continuing the season, because anger is actually a practice in the work of justice. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes him very effective.
Yeah. All right. So, and I think that means Jesus should make sure the Lakers win the NBA championship.
In the name of Kobe.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like, and we don't have to talk about way white people talk about Kobe without many awareness of what the actual history is on lots of things and what happened over the course of his life. That drives me up a wall. But anyway, I'm not even going to have an excursus. There are a few things that derail Tripp completely from theology, and one is the Lakers.
And I haven't even mentioned Black Panther. Black Panther passed.
Oh, well,
I don't know if I want to get you into that. I was going to put my Wakanda thing right down, as my backdrop, but I was too busy today with everything.
All right. Well, I'll ask a very nerdy question. Then we'll talk about Black Panther. All right.
We got to talk Marvel.
All right. So how do you and Adam think the Christian contemplative tradition relates to Black liberation theology, given the emphasis on activism / praxis in many theologies of liberation? Do you think these areas are in tension with one another?
Wow, that's a great question. I've been wrestling with that because I actually was teaching a contemplative class when George Floyd got shot.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think I mentioned this in one of my talks. I was teaching a class on actually Anthony DeMello, right, and he's a Indian kind of contemplative Christian. He mixes both tradition, kind of like Panther, I guess, in terms of that. And I was so angry that I have to lead the class in contemplative work and a meditation at the beginning. And I was so angry that it was hard for me to go interiorly in a very peaceful way. So that's when I called, the director of the program, and I said, look, I don't know if I could do this tonight. And he said, well, start from your place of anger, and anger can be creative. That is God speaking to you. So to me, the contemplative work was about actually working from anger. And I kind of forgotten, because most of the time when you talk about meditation and contemplative work, you want to work from a place of harmony and peace, loving kindness, that type of thing. But to really work from anger was just a different way of doing it. But the thing I actually work on most of the time in terms of Black theology is Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman to me is the person. I use Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King, and I call it the mystical prophetic, right? Thurman is the mystic. King does the prophecy. Thurman does a deep dive into the inner life, while I think King is the greatest reflection of revisioning our external life, right? But what I've learned in terms of race and contemplation is that mindfulness, I'll say in the broader category, is not so much about transforming issues of race, but it's about the quality of mind and awareness you bring to a racial issue. And what I mean about that is that you can sit in, lotus positions or meditations and do all these type of practices. It's not so much geared to transform the outer. It's going to transform you, but it transforms you to bring a different form of awareness to it, right? And I would not underestimate that, because what it does is help you. In the contemplative community, what they'll say is, don't bring your confusion to a fist fight, right? Like it's like you might have racial confusion inwardly, and then you're trying to fight externally for racial justice, but you bring your own racial confusion and then you add to it, right? So a lot of times some of the inner work has to be about us getting over our own racial or gender or any type of confusion on the inside. And I think contemplative work helps us do that, before as a prerequisite, or actually maybe even simultaneously, maybe not as a prerequisite, not like you have to be a perfect person. We're all flawed vessels, but it's a simultaneously working on your inward confusion while you're trying to resist the outward evil.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if one part of it is how any movement, work, or activism where you aren't, where your identity isn't in some way detached from the success of what's going on, can get draining, overwhelming, and things. And so one part of contemplative relationship to activism and prophetic movements is the recognition that showing up and doing good and planting justice and this type of thing is an end in and of itself. And you aren't the only agent that decides, like what happens and what progress is made. And I know, like, Richard Rohr spends time talking about the relationship between the two. And I don't remember, in the Cornell West Reader, I think, or some one of them, when he's talking about the difference between jazz and blues, is that and what the affect of the two for the Black experience, and you can tell me if I think this is kind of how it goes, is it the blues makes exposing the nerve ends in a community, all of a sudden, like when the blues singer is telling the truth from the stage, everyone realizes they aren't alone holding those nerve ends. They're like torn, like the experience, the pain of the day, right? Like, I've had my heart broken before. I've worked and not ever think I got ends, and all these type of things. And the blues musician, the dirtier they tell the truth, the more fullness of the humanity that comes out, right? And that has this type of endeavor. And then he talks about how, like, the jazz musician, like, when you're doing jazz well, you're not listening to the voice of an individual or how an individual guitarist bends something or paint the pain. All of a sudden, this community of musicians enter a flow, and that flow, they distance from their own selves, right, and become this collective. And if you're listening, you join this rhythm and this movement, and in that moment, you're all together. But you're precisely together by not being yourself, as opposed to, right, the blues singer exposing their individuality in such a particular way. It connects to this universal experience of pain, suffering, and such. The blue in jazz, like, brings into this flow, this state. And I think of the jazz, like, as the contemplative element, where where you find, like, the what is the love supreme? It was the hum that was going underneath everything the whole time, right? Like, and it wells you up. But then, like, the blues is this, it gives you permission to expose yourself because they're exposing themselves. And so,
I never thought that way. Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that in the tradition of contemplation. And in terms of, I was thinking about more traditional renderings of contemplative life in terms of mindfulness.
Oh, yeah,
but that's actually mindfulness. It's just the aesthetic kind of expression of it. But I don't. Most Black people wouldn't associate that in terms of, wouldn't frame it as contemplative. But I can see by the way you're describing it how it could be understood that way. That's really interesting.
I read there was in cognitive science and religion stuff, I got into reading all the different studies on flow states, and then, like, how you track brains. So, like, there's like strong parallels between people in the contemplative brain and then, like, the gifted jazz musician brain, right? And then if you look at the difference of people that do contemplative prayer in community versus one that do it on their own, like, the same person, right? Like, if you take, and people get this is why you go to a guru, but, like, the actual, at least some of the scientific evidence that I've spent some time on, there's this brand new book on it I've been reading. Hearing Voices and Other Matters of the Mind, What Mental Abnormalities Can Teach Us About Religions. Fascinating book. But the
not as good as the book I'm reading.
Oh yeah, Divine Self-Investment by me. So why is it more effective if 5 people go sit in the room with someone who's much better at contemplation? Right? People think it is, and it actually is statistically true. And it's not just the numbers of people. The numbers of people have like when it's more than 4 people, there is a jump if they all participate. But if you're actually in the room with someone whose like heart rate, brain states, and stuff shift earlier, it actually adds to what everyone else is doing. That's right. And those same type of patterns happen in bands when they get in flow states. So anyway, that was kind of the connection point.
It makes so much sense because, the question becomes with like, in terms of the liberationist framing, how are you related to racial distress or racial violence? How are you personally related to it? Or how are you related to this type of, if you're Black, you're talking about how are you related to this kind of almost permanence of white supremacy that you constantly feel under siege? Well, I go to jazz and blues, or I go to musical traditions to put my mind in a certain type of, I forgot what you said, vibration or frequency that I can relate to it, that it doesn't have a grip on my humanity, right? Or it loosens its grip, right? It doesn't have a complete hold. There's a space for me to actually think otherwise or think differently. And I think even kind of traditional forms of mindfulness and contemplation, that's what the question is. It's about how are you personally related to this issue? So it's not about necessarily out there kind of advocating for policy or advocating for change. It's about relating. It's about how you personally are not being caught up in the narrative, and you can still have spaces where you can love your family, you can love your friends, that you're not just consumed by anger, that your other parts of your human self you could express to your neighbors and in your personal life. Because what happens too much, especially on the left, there's burnout. We get burned out. We have to fight all these types of issues and battles all the time that there's nothing to replenish, renourish, and nurture us. So I'm a big advocate for healthy ways to regenerate. And I think mindfulness, contemplation, these type of practices are healthy ways that we can regenerate ourselves so that we can fight the good fight, so that we can fight the battle. So I think these type of times in COVID have kept a lot of people sane by having certain types of spiritual practices, listening to jazz music, maybe having like a meditative practice or a contemplative practice, or which are many. But I'm a big advocate of that, especially for people who are progressives, because I see too many of my friends just get. You could actually there's a danger of becoming the very thing you fight against. You fight against tyrants, and you become a tyrant unknowingly, right? So we have to kind of, be very cautious that we don't mimic the evil that we oppose.
All right. Wakanda.
Okay. Oh, Wakanda forever. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I had 2 different messages about it. And one was how they didn't realize, as like, not just like the Black Panther was such a powerful movie and stuff, and enjoyed it, but like what it meant when kind of like that expression of, Afrofuturism and stuff came on the screen. Like what it meant for the Black community, until you start hearing all these memorials and all these like video clips that are going around and everything. And anyway, so one of the questions was about like how you saw one of that I got another person forwarded this sermon that was interpreting the resurrection connected to Black Panther things, and it just went seamlessly. And the minister knew everyone in the church had already seen the movie at least twice, And he was like, I don't think I've ever been at a church where everyone knew they saw a movie twice except for Passion of the Christ, and I wish they hadn't. I mean, you could, if you want to say a bit about like the movie itself, and then thinking, about the context of it in general. Like, anyway.
Yeah, I think, well, certainly, like, look, I think that, in terms of this course, the fundamental question of Black theology is, what does it mean to be Black and Christian, right? I think the idea of what it means to be Black is where the Wakanda kind of narrative and mythology hits the most, right? Because Black people have been orphans of history, right? They've had this erased history. And to really have this type of image.
Like the double consciousness from the first week's reading.
Certainly, yeah, the erasure of consciousness, the double consciousness, you could, in that sense. But really, the idea of Blackness has been so denigrated, right? To see Blackness visually depicted in visual arts of beauty and grandeur and of technological civilization that's more advanced than even white civilizations, right? Like that had a tremendous impact worldwide. It's almost like how ancient Egypt, right, like was more advanced than Greek civilization, right? Wakanda almost has the same type of mythological effect that Atlantis had with 19th century whites, in terms of that, like this type of lost civilization that's buried underwater, right? That actually had people who were doing like advanced technology, math, science, and skills in terms of that. But so that's, I think, in terms of the imagination, right? How do you imagine yourself as your future possibilities? And I think the Wakanda mythology has that type of impact on the Black community, where it's really captured their imagination about a new possibility in human life. I could be that great. I can master science and technology, right? I can talk about a civilization that's far advanced than the ones I'm currently in, right? And I think that's probably has the greatest impact, and that's what we call Afrofuturism, right? It's kind of to imagine what the future can be like. And so much of futurism hasn't been inclusive of Black culture to really see the traditions of Africa connected to a possible Elon Musk kind of future, who actually is African, actually, but actually was born in Africa, right? To really talk about the future that way was I guess had a consequential impact on Black people throughout the world. I think that's kind of the first step. I also call Wakanda, for those of you who know about Malcolm X and know about Elijah Muhammad, like I think Elijah Muhammad was imagining what Wakanda was too. I think that's what his vision of Black civilization was, where he wanted to separate from white society and start this kind of new Black territory. I think he had in mind like a kind of Wakanda's type civilization. And I think the Nation of Islam has been thinking about Wakanda for a long, long time. It's about 7-year history in this country.
Mm-hmm. In the story itself, in the movie and some of the times in the comic books, always has this question of what happens if the engine of Western colonialism, namely stolen Black bodies, had their own narrative and access to an energy source, vibranium, that wasn't stolen, right? It was theirs. Right. So it is they have the power, more power than the West did, by taking lands and stealing people. And what did they do with it is the question, right? And if you read the comics, it plays out in a lot of different ways. But in the movie, T'Challa is this transition figure, right? Where they start to engage outward, but they don't know the power they have. And they've chosen not to engage the West for lots of reasons, right? And Killmonger's character, Michael B. Jordan plays, is thinking like, no, we have to go right and have this fight with the rest of the world. And so like even in the story you get that kind of like early Malcolm versus MLK battle around like violence and Black identity and what does it mean to be African playing out. And then what ends up happening, right, is this by the end of the movie is the internalization of we cannot be ourselves apart from all of us, right? That Killmonger was insisting on being internalized to the power that is possessed in Wakanda, but without the desire to colonize. So what do? They go to Oakland, right? It's investing in schools and people and possibilities. And then if you go through the MCU, it's literally where everyone goes when the Infinity Gauntlet comes. Like, what is the one place that's possible to go is Wakanda, right? So if we are attacked, right? If you think of what would make us all as a species decide like the boundaries we put between ourselves, nation state boundaries, race, and all these things we invent to decide we're not in this together, right? We put up all these, what is it with an alien invasion? Now, what if it's someone with a giant like glove with all these powerful rocks on it and can eliminate half the planet and on every planet with a snap, right? Where do you go? Wakanda. What is the immediate response of all the people? They know what it means to be Wakanda is we're all going to die to give time to help a white guy get a rock out of his head. Like, and like this not go down. The whole story is there's a story of valor of this is what it looks like to have power, not corrupted by colonialism.
Yeah, and that's what most people think. I like the way you frame that. Like, what would happen to Black people unmolested by slavery and colonialism? How can we imagine a new possibility for Blackness? That's why many people talk about Wakanda. Like, we've had Wakandas, we've had ancient Ethiopia, we've had Timbuktu, we've had ancient Ghana, like all these type of Black civilizations that predate European civilization as being Wakanda. Also significant is to talk about the Dora Milaje, right? We're talking about womanism, right? We're going to talk about more, do a deep dive into it with Monica. But the Dora Milaje, incredible. You have like kind of, one body with many parts, right? Like in terms of that. But as a womanist image of power and beauty and skill, it's hard to beat. But, another image, when you talk about Black Panther, you mentioned the difference between between the comic books and the movie, right? Like in terms of that. But it's always important to tell people that Black Panther is a spirit, right? It's not just the person. Right. Later in the comic books, Black Panther it's also a gender fluid spirit.
Yeah.
Fury becomes Black Panther later on.
Which may happen in Black Panther 2 now.
Right, exactly. So to really talk about Black Panther, it's empowered by spirit. We're getting Black theology, right? We're getting theological discussion. It's not just a person or a superhero, right? Like it's something that it incarnates, right, into different people. That might be one way of kind of reading, the Gospels in terms of that, like in terms of the Christ as a cosmic Christ and that kind of thing. But it kind of mirrors a lot of that idea. But it incarnates people who have integrity, humility, and kind of, forgiveness, like people of integrity, basically. It's not like anybody, but that's where the African rituals come in terms of that. It can't just incarnate into anybody. But it basically, in terms of, when Black Panther first came out, right, I think it was in the 60s, but, the image of Blackness in Africa was Tarzan, right? So what it aimed to do, and I think Ryan Coogler, who's the Black director of the film, really wanted to kind of unshackle the limits on the Black imagination in order to imagine new possibilities. So there's a lot of echoes with both the African past in terms of its classical greatness and also pointing to a new direction for the future. And I think that's the brilliance of that movie and that kind of imagery.
In the and this gets explored more in the comics, but that the Black Panther, in a sense, is like a vocational role, where the spirit of the Panther moves, from person to person. It's also the person who speaks with the ancestors, right? And so it's not just that they're powerful for the people in the present. Part of the power is being intimately connected with the ancestors. And there is this one line where the Panther and the connection with the ancestors is broken, and basically it is ultimately destructive, right? Like in the same way some of the stories of Israel are, like if you have a temple and you have a king and then no one reads Torah and follows it, junk just hits the fan, right? Like, so if you have a Panther and they aren't connecting with the ancestors, then what is that power good for? It's the own undoing of Wakanda. And so like it's interesting if in the those type of stories are in almost every religious tradition. It's an important part of myths. Like you could see similar things in in Star Wars and such, but the role of the ancestors is important, and it came up in a couple of questions, so maybe you want to say something about it, but like not just in the context of Wakanda, but we had a question that was connected to stuff like Monica talked about in one of the articles. We had a question from a participant from Africa and stuff that where ancestors have a different function culturally, so they were trying to understand the divine when the relationship some of their neighbors have to ancestors is more close to treating them as deity than
of course, yeah.
So as a theologian, right, a Christian theologian, how do you reflect about the notion of God in connection to ancestors, especially if you're concerned not to problematize like your allegiance or whatever to
well, that's the only people that have problems with that are Protestant Christians, right? Because Catholics,
that's true.
It's like that's specifically a Protestant problem. That's not even problematized in other types of Christian traditions, or even in Eurocentric Protestantism, I might say, because so maybe the problem is having this type of radical monotheism rather than seeing other people as channels of divinity, right? Like, because that's been kind of the human cultures throughout the world have done this, like, and even Catholicism has a rich kind of elaborate cosmology of saints and other people. But in African or traditional culture, ancestors are spiritual presences. Monica does a great good job in her book of talking about how these, I think she calls them cultural heroes also. So in our community, a cultural hero might be, like, ancestors are usually seen as our biological link. Cultural heroes would be someone like a Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, but they're all channels of divinity. Think about Protestantism. It talks about it doesn't have ancestral veneration, but it functions in ancestral veneration, right? Like people use like Abraham Lincoln and George Washington as their kind of civic ancestors. Like it's hard to not do this, but it's just not acknowledged and framed in that way. But our cultural memory, like ancestors are seen in a lot of different ways in terms of its dynamic interaction. But in biblical, if you're talking about from a Christian standpoint, we talk about it as a cloud of witnesses, right? The communion of saints, the cloud of witnesses that are constantly around us, right? Like even Jesus, in terms of his Hebrew, they talk about that he venerated his ancestors, right? In terms of, well, even Apostle Paul, when he's talking to the book of Hebrews, he has to kind of explain Jesus by saying, in the context of our ancestors, here's how Jesus fits in, right? He's trying to explain to other Jews how Christ is like the fulfillment of their ancestral desires and dreams, right? In terms of that. So, I say all that to say that it seems to me a flattening of reality, a one-dimensionalist, when we don't acknowledge the communion of saints, when we don't acknowledge the cloud of witnesses that precedes in our we're interacting with as we walk in our daily lives. Like, it's so taken for grantedness in most human situations that that I think that the type of radical monotheism is an erasure of part of our humanity, to look at that God as a radically other that's only mediated through Jesus Christ as the exclusive mediator, right? I'm not even sure if that's a healthy relationship to think about Christian faith with. And I think, in the African tradition that we have that God is, and also I think that, even that kind of is denial of a Trinitarian aspect of God. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that we're a person for others, that we're a person in the company of others, right? That we are inherently related, that ancestors are part of that relationship, that we're not just connected with people who are living, we're connecting with people who are past, that we have to expand our notion of community to include not just the visible, but the invisible. Mm-hmm. I think that's a healthier way to kind of proceed as in our spiritual lives.
And I think that if you pay attention to some of these questions in the context of cultural anthropology, like when you look at a relationship with the ancestors is present in an overwhelming majority of cultures. It's just most of us live in a kind of technological one that is determined by kind of Western Enlightenment framework, right? And it's not just ancestors that were removed from the world. We flattened the world and removed all elements of enchantment. So much so that most people don't know if God does anything. And
it's an enlightenment problem. It's an enlightenment problem.
Yeah.
It's actually living under kind of modern modernity that we kind of separate ourselves from being in a way that it's a Cartesian kind of epistemological problem that we can't see that way.
Yeah. Do you know Alton Pollard?
I know who he is. Yeah.
He's at Howard. I think he's at the.
He moved. I think he's at Louisville.
Okay. So he was at Wake Forest University, and then I know he was at Howard for a while, and then was at Emory. But great Black theologian from North Carolina, and
former Cone student.
He was? Okay. So he said he gave this talk one time at an event we were speaking at, and this is a guild event, so no one thinks of papers at an academic guild as sermons, but he decided, you could tell when you decide to leave the podium where everyone else had stared at their paper while talking. And he got to this point, and this is connected to one of the questions people asked about the Enlightenment. And he was talking about it. And a large number at most guild meetings are not African Americans. They're white religion scholars.
You don't say.
And yeah. And so one of the questions we had was about rethinking through the dichotomy of light and dark. And he's laying out what parts of our spiritual reality the Enlightenment has fissured from us. And we have to spend all this time to get back to. And he's and if you're good at the Enlightenment and a theologian, then you do the death of God, because that's the only way you can use the word God and be honest, right? When you're fully enlightened, right? He's going on and on. And so then he starts to problematize it. And he gets to the end and he goes, in very everyone's paying attention kind of thing. And he goes, so what would a theology of the endarkenment mean?
Right. Yeah.
And he said, because I can tell you that sometimes I'm reading Paul Tillich and my ancestors are saying, maybe not yet. So like he starts to bring in this space where there are so many assumptions we just think are normative, right? And like you succeed by assuming these things and figuring out how you fit stuff back in. And so the question of things like the ancestors, all the way down to the way we've bifurcated nature, right? And so like humans are the exceptions because we might shove a soul in them, but everything else is mindless and pointless. Like there are all these ways it shows up. And I just remember being so struck by the endarkenment thing because it gets at, what one of the questions was pointing at was, can we reframe dark to move away from it as an evil concept? Is light connected to goodness and whiteness? And like, what do we do with that binary? Yeah. And in my immediate response, like went to that talk Dr. Pollard gave as a way to go. It's not just like, oh, well, the Black church has African traditional religion with ancestors, so we'll make space for them to do that. It's no. Like their insistence to holding on these things might actually be a gift to the white church that's been so faithful to the Enlightenment. They've managed to squeeze all the enchantment of God's creations out on behalf of their telescope and their microscope.
Right. Yeah. The imagery of darkness and lightness, that's it comes from traditional cultures, but it didn't have an association directly with people, human beings, until, race was created and invented, right? Even in African cultures. But it wasn't exclusively where darkness was seen as negative and whiteness was seen as brazen. That took on moral meaning through racism and white supremacy. In general, darkness could be seen as creative, right? Like out of darkness, it was generative. Like darkness was something that was seen as a cosmic of goodness. And whiteness was seen as like kind of ghostly. When you die, you turn white, your skin turns white. So it depends on what culture we're talking about, where whiteness can have a negative connotation and darkness positive, right? And those are, in the advent of the kind of fiction of race, it took on meaning and added to the kind of denigration of African bodies, right? So now we're trying to undo that. So we're trying to kind of reverse the symbolism within the context of modernity. And so we're trying to find more kind of creative ways to think about, well, how do we actually have a chain of associations associated with darkness that has positive moral meaning? Instead of the kind of unconscious connection where you think of Blackness, there's always a negative thing. So part of endarkenment, right, is a way of trying to reverse the racialization, right, or of wisdom, of intelligence, of knowledge, right, like in terms of that. That's also true with rereading the Table of Nations. That was a kind of comment, where the Table of Nations, in terms of the children of Noah and Ham, children of Noah, the whole Noah story, right, is like a second creation story.
Right.
Right? Like you have the first in Genesis, you have a second where the whole world is wiped out. And then you have Noah's three sons that people read as starting, kind of new humanity. And early European scholars started to really comment on how, when they encounter other races, they try to say, well, where's this race fit in? Because the Bible, of course, explains everything in human existence. So we have to find something in the Bible that makes sense of these people who are darker than us that we didn't even know existed until recently. And they go back to Noah, right? And they read the creation of races as coming from Ham was seen as Black folks. I think Shem was Jewish, and Japheth, how do you pronounce that? Was white, European. Japheth, I can't remember. I'm probably butchering the name. So it talked about the origin. Now, Protestants in general don't really see it that. First of all, to even rely on the Bible as a historically reliable in terms of human origins is problematic in and of itself. But you still have people who take that seriously, and also, if you're in New York City and you see like the Black Hebrew Israelites like shouting down white people and that type of thing, they're they're doing a radical reading of the Table of Nations. Or if you see them say, like, you're not the real Jews, we're the real Jews. See, they're doing a certain type of reinterpretation of the Table of Nations, right? In terms of that, and saying that no, the Jewish, and they're starting from there and rereading the lineages, right, of every human group. And I haven't studied this so carefully because it's very, very complicated, and you can kind of justify almost any type of conclusion from it, because there's so many. Most of the human groups that came out of that are now no longer existent. But if you look at the territories, you could say, hey, well, the Puerto Ricans are here and the Koreans are here and that kind of thing. And some people do that. They may go, but I haven't devoted, it's too detailed or specifics. But in general, if you are confused, like Nick Cannon got in trouble a little bit ago by talking about this, but it really starts with looking at the Table of Nations as a historically reliable point for talking about human origins and racial difference.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the basis of it.
Yeah. And it's not the only time powerful people created a map and then decided to interpret the world by it that generated problems.
Yeah.
Once they start classifying things can go south. Just like I had a friend that wrote a dissertation, a post-colonial interpretation of all the variations of how Hegel, he does his lectures on the philosophy of religion. There's like 9 versions of them, what we have. And depending on how much information he'd gained on different religions at different points, he puts them in different categories of how close they are to pinnacle religion. And anyway, it's not saying we don't need maps and we don't need structures to think things through. It's just sometimes people never visit the terrains, and then
map becomes a territory.
Yeah,
right. Taxonomy in and of itself has been a problem. I mean, that's what we're revolting against now, like the whole taxonomy of human worth and everything, of trying to classify and categorize. It's interesting because when we talk to young people, I'm sure you have this with your undergrads, like people who are 18, like the whole idea is don't put me in a box. Don't boundary me. Like when I'm talking to even about kind of racial issues, if there's a lot of younger black people who, if you say, are you black? Or they'll say, oh, no, don't box me in, don't limit me and that kind of thing. But really it's responding to a certain type of taxonomy, right, that's been imposed. And I think there's a cultural thing that's going on, especially with American youth, whether it be a gender box or racial box, right? People find these type of any type of classifications as almost intrinsically restrictive, problematic, and sometimes even oppressive. Now, I wouldn't go that far as all of them. I think there should be some type of adjustment of fluidity, but it's interesting the kind of pushback you get from some people about that.
Right,
that comes from. Yeah.
I was going to say the last question, because it's almost midnight for me, is what are 3 books you've recently enjoyed? And I got mine. Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Adam's high quality product placement is
there you go.
Is my own book, A Divine Self-Investment, which everyone should clearly get 4 copies for all their friends. But hold on, let me turn off my thingy, Bob, so I can. I have my books. All right. So this one, The Claim to Christianity, Responding to the Far Right. Ulrich and Hannah Ulrich's on faculty with me here at University of Edinburgh, and Hannah's at in the politics and ethics department. But they just booked together, and it's on how the religious right in Europe is claiming Christianity and stuff. Which, if you're an American like me, one, it was helpful to get to know about it. But the second part is, it will just creep you out because it's way too accurate, but different story, right? Like in America, the way like the religious right clocks onto religion to then pervert it for these type of like far right politics and stuff. And the theological engagement and ethical responses are super helpful. This has been my quiet time reading. John Sobrino's spiritual writings.
Okay.
It's so good. John Sobrino is like one of my favorite liberation theologians. And it's spectacular. And the introduction is worth just the book. And then John Cobb's new book, Salvation, Jesus' Mission and Ours, is pretty exciting. I just started it, so I'm only like 2 chapters in, but it begins with what did Jesus mean by the kingdom of God and all that kind of stuff, and then how do we understand our current context and emerging crises and all that kind of thing, and then it's like, how do you connect the two and think about the individual, the community, the collective, the social, the political, and not wanting to, kill the planet and everything. So
I think you're up to 5 books there, Trip. I think you.
Oh no, I didn't count my own. That's because I'm not really reading it. Well, I am reading it, by the way. Like, if you don't like buying books, you can be in the homebrewed community, and then you'll get a chapter of audio each week of me reading my own book.
There you go.
And I added in the front of it. This is total, like, I record myself reading the chapter, and then after it, I like time myself and summarize what I think is important in the chapter in 5 minutes, and then stick it at the front. So I don't know if that turns into like a 30-minute summary of my book, or just 30 minutes of Trip thinking about how he really liked reading himself, But,
for me, I'm gonna focus on the Black theology materials that I've been reading. I don't have my books right in front of me right now. I'm not in arm's length, but there's a couple of them. First, I'd like to talk about Monica Coleman's book, Making a Way Out of No Way. It's not her latest book, but she wrote this. I can't remember the date on it, but I'm actually using it in a class, and I've used it before. It's a process book. It's a process womanism. Making a way out. I think her chapters. I think she brilliantly, from a white-headian perspective, really talks about that question of ancestorship that you were referring to, where process much better than I do. But what is it about memory that Whitehead talks about, that memory or moral something about
that? Memories are not just like something that happened in the past. Each moment of becoming receives the past completely. So there's also what parts of it you're conscious to, what ways you're conscious to it, so the ongoing growth of the universe, right, moment to moment, the ongoing process that is you in becoming. Memories are always internalized into that moment. So you really do carry the universe with you moment to moment, but also what is it of your past you say names you, right? And who are your ancestors is one way of putting it. In the same way that you ask that question to a good counselor, right, helps you pick, when you're telling your story, not the times you've been a victim, not the times you've experienced shame, but the times you've strived and overcome, the times you've experienced deep joy, the times you were the good friend, the time, what is it you tell her? Anyway, sorry. I don't have to, you ask the man the process question. And
well, you look, listen, it would take me a half hour to just say what you did in 2 minutes. So another book I've been asked to actually do a review on, and I kind of ghosted the publisher when COVID happened a bit, but I want to uplift it. It's called The Religion of the Negro by Vincent Lloyd. It's actually on Black secularism and Black theology. I think it's a really brilliant book. Maybe I should kind of turn off my screen so you can kind of see this as well. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Vincent Lloyd wrote, I think, a really, really good book. It's really dense though too. Like, look, this is a very academic book. He talks about Cone, Baldwin, Mbembe, Derrida, Agamben, Sylvia Wynter. Let me show you some of the table of contents there. It's really a brilliant read, kind of almost like political theology, which is kind of a thing du jour. I haven't finished it. I really do want to write a review, but this semester's been so crazy. And it's taken me, when I originally agreed, I thought it'd be a kind of a quick read, but I realized this is like, you got to take your time with this book. Take your time. But if you're a philosophical or theoretically oriented person, you really enjoy that book. Also, I've been probably asked, the book I've been asked to talk the most about would be Willie Jennings' Christian Imagination, the Origins of Theology and Place. And that's a kind of almost a classic. I think they wrote that in the early 2000s. But that book really talks about the kind of the interrelationship between Christianity and whiteness. Mm-hmm. And he talks about it as whiteness as kind of this religious construct, and how Christianity has been the midwife, has given birth to whiteness, and how they're almost inextricable. And he's calling for a new kind of ecclesial imagination that could go beyond whiteness. He actually has a book out now that's more current on whiteness itself. I haven't read it personally, but I've heard good things about it. But Willie Jennings, as an author, I think is really speaking really powerfully to the times. Also related, another Duke theological verse is Cameron Carter's Race: A Theological Account. Another kind of dense book. All these books are kind of dense, and I've been like, and I'm trying to think about people that a lay person could read, like in terms of that. I think Monica Coleman's a little bit more suitable, but Race: A Theological Account also is a similar project of talking about the theological origins of the concept of race, right? And get kind of accounting of that and is a tour de force to the Christian tradition. Really dense, philosophical. I think it's part of his dissertation that he rewrote. But if you're a person who's into kind of a high theory and enjoys that kind of stuff, you like either one of those texts.
Well, and I know one person asked the question about ontological blackness. That book picks it up quite significantly.
Oh, okay. So when I said, okay, yeah, actually, Victor Anderson's book. Yeah, I did a panel on the 30th anniversary of. I need to publish that of that book, and Victor's a friend of mine, and I disagree with him. I said, like, look, the problem is not ontological blackness. The problem is ontological whiteness, right? Ontological blackness is really just a response, and I see it as more of a theopoetic rather than some type of, Aristotelian category that's like so stable and solid, right? As a substance ontology, like the idea of ontology, I see as more of a theopoetic category, like the way Cone used it. So I think he misreads Cone in that intent, but it's kind of maybe that's it.
Oh yeah, no, that's
conversation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But all right.
You're Dr. Fuller, though, so I'm trying to assume that the audience are not all Claremont grads.
Well, I mean, I think it's always helpful for people to realize that, while we're focusing on Cone, like the Black Theology Conversation's larger, and like part of any like intellectual tradition are people challenging assumptions that the previous generation took for granted, right? Like we gave, like how Monica talked about the emergence of womanism and then second and third wave, right? Like, and what does that look like? And one of the things that those type of narratives, when you like see a conversation, the way it moves, at least for me, is then Like, what is the question or two that you have decided like you're going to keep asking and demand a better answer for? And you don't have to know, right, like what your answer is going to be, but you can know like what we say in response to this right now just doesn't cut it. And yet, like, this is my tribe. These are the people I wrestle with, and I trust their intuitions. I want to speak from. And like, who you decide to argue with is an affirmation of them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let me. I want to react to that a bit because I'm doing an intro to theology class at my college, and to your question, this is the book I'm actually another book. Let me take down this screen again.
Oh, Miroslav Volf.
Yeah. I think in terms of that also, and the reason why this is important to your statement, at least for me, is he talks about the question of flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
Flourishing. To me, that's the question I'm wrestling with, and I think a lot of progressives and really know what they're against, but don't know what they're for. Right? Don't have a vision of flourishing. We used to have the vision of beloved community that keeps us all together, and that's still an animating vision. Right. But I think we need to have more, kind of images of what does flourishing look like. I know in our, musical text, right, flourishing looks like kind of the acquisition of things. It's like the type of car you drive, the type of clothes you wear. I'm talking about hip hop culture mostly specifically. But those are the type of flourishing, especially for oppressed people, a lot of times mirrors what you were starved of and what you lacked. So therefore, designer items become like adornments in a sense of worth. But I think in theology, what we must do is hold a line to a vision of human flourishing. This will also help us in our choice of elections when we try to choose between, one party or the other, that we have to imagine ourselves actually holding a road that the vote is necessary but not sufficient, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's necessary to vote, but it's not sufficient. We are following not just the win in November, but our vision of human flourishing, which is beyond November, right? And that's what should be animating us in terms of that. Those are just tactical moves, voting. Strategically, we have to be moving from our vision. And that's what I think that this book actually helps us do. And I think, and this is accessible to folks who are not necessarily theologically trained. And I think that would be a good place to start on that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for hanging out, and thank all of you for that have hung out now or later.
I'm also at a Catholic school, Laudato Si, in terms of creation. Like we've been doing that too. We're talking about integral ecology, right? Which I think is another really important thing that gets under stress within theology, but the idea that humans and environment really we have to pay more attention to, right? We can see this with the hurricanes and all the kind of unnatural disasters. That to me, the elections are more than just the victory of a party, but I look at our current situation as not just an economic, racial threat, but as a species threat, right? The very conditions of life are at stake. I don't mean to be too apocalyptic about this, but I think we're really I think we're past the tipping point, but we're really at in terms of the pace of acceleration, the people who hold the doomsday clock just say it starts inching to inching. We're already at 11:59, right?
Yeah.
Seconds away. And I think the vote might hold it in place. It's not going to reverse the clock, right? But I think as people who privilege life under the Spirit, we need to think about what will reverse the clock, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this type of literature, in terms of looking at the ecological issue and challenge, will help us move in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, it was fun hanging out, and we'll see all of you next week. And if you have more questions, send them, and especially when we see it from multiple people, and we know, make sure to talk about it. Some of the questions you mentioned that people send in are things we're going to talk about already in either one of the deep dives and stuff. So we, are waiting. Otherwise, Adam will sit there and say like, well, I was going to say this, but I already said it in the Q&A, and we don't want to steal the thunder. So
if I know it's late for you, stay away from pools and fall wells. And
yeah. I mean, I got an inflatable hot tub now. That's best quarantine purchase.
It's not the pools that get you in trouble. It's to be the pool boy for Falwell. That's almost got you in trouble.
I want to get some investment money. You know? Like, do you want to invest in a progressive Christian podcast?
Hey, there you go.
Yeah.
Liberty Valley. Anybody from Liberty out there? It's the guy.
All right.